Well, now, many in the West are critical of China's inroads into Africa, which they view with suspicion. But dissenting voices are emerging, and foremost among them is Professor Deborah Brautigam, author of the book The Dragon's Gift. BON's Tom Spender caught up with her while she was in Beijing.
China's engagement in Africa is catalyzing a continent and dividing opinion. Big infrastructure projects are going up rapidly in some of the world's poorest countries, built by Chinese companies and paid for using Africa's natural resources, such as oil or minerals. But this has alarmed many in the West, who accuse China of ignoring human rights abuses and propping up dictators as it scrambles for raw materials. However, Professor Deborah Brautigam of American University in Washington, D.C. argues otherwise. In The Dragon's Gift, published last year, she argues that Chinese engagement in Africa stands a good chance of at last raising living standards there, something the West has failed to do.
What the Chinese are doing is bringing together the resource aspect and the development infrastructure, and they're using the resource to secure loans that then finance development infrastructure. So it's a package like this. The West has no similar model for how to operate, and we're not able to do things like this. And I think it's a very interesting experiment that's going on. And of course, time will tell how well it works. So a lot of challenges there in terms of there's not international competitive bidding, maintenance issues, kickbacks perhaps. So a lot of things that could be going on there. But time will tell whether or not this infrastructure investment is what Africa needs. My guess is that it is, and that will work out for a whole host of areas. Reducing costs, for example. African production costs are very high because the infrastructure is so bad. In Nigeria, all the companies have to have their own generators because they don't get electric power. This could change.
These infrastructure projects are already making a real difference in Africa, Professor Brautigam says.
People who drive around from country to country many times remark to me that there are now roads that are built by Chinese companies that are linking up countries that either had no roads or they didn't have bridges on the roads, but Chinese companies have been building these. Sometimes the Chinese government finances it, and sometimes other sources are providing the finance, but the Chinese companies are doing these projects in a more cost-effective way. So it's also bringing in interest in doing infrastructure, as I mentioned, by other financiers and other aid agencies. So we're going to be seeing more inroads into creating the bridges, creating the railways, creating the ports, creating the roads that African countries need to be linked to each other. And that's a very interesting possibility for the future. You know, you can't drive along West Africa from country to country along the coast. There's no road. And one Chinese bank I was speaking to said that they were interested in financing a road that would go along the coast in West Africa. It hasn't happened yet, but that's the thinking.
Brautigam argues that Western criticisms are mainly motivated by fear of a rising China, while in fact African countries like dealing with China because it doesn't tell them how to run their affairs and is not tainted by having participated in colonial abuses there.
The Chinese are presenting a challenge because we're used to thinking about Africa as a place of pathos, a place that needs our help, and we have a kind of condescending attitude towards Africa and patronizing attitude, and a lot of African governments have suffered under this attitude for a long time, but now they have an alternative source of finance, and they're really appreciating this. They've got policy space. They don't have to submit to economic conditionalities that were imposed on them earlier, and political conditionalities as well. We tend to view these in very simplistic terms, and it's important to get the reality of what's going on in this complicated relationship, and then we can engage China a lot better than if we just take the headline stories and think that's what it's all about.
But it would be a mistake simply to see China's interest in Africa purely through the prism of natural resources. In fact, China sees Africa as an important market for manufactured goods as well.
And this trade diversification and finding new markets for Chinese companies is really important. You can see this with the flagship companies like Huawei or Zhongxing Telecommunications or CCECC in construction. And there are a number of others, Haier, Hisense. A lot of them are setting up operations in Africa. Some of them are doing manufacturing there. These are being welcomed by and large, these investments. And American companies and other companies from the West have been much more focused on resources. And the Chinese are focused on resources, but also diversified.
Only time will tell if China's self-interested economic activity can bring prosperity to Africa. But if Professor Brautigam is to be believed, it stands a better chance than decades of Western aid. Tom Spender, BON.
Interesting, because China's resources for infrastructure approach to Africa is informed by its own experience with Japan 30 years ago. Japan actually gave China $10 billion worth of credit that it could use to buy Japanese-made goods in return for Chinese oil. And of course, China's now using this same model with Africa.
Yeah, this whole history of Chinese investment in Africa actually it goes back much further than many people think. Chinese traders, in particular from the eastern province of Zhejiang, did expand rapidly towards Africa during the first half of the 20th century, but their activity was actually halted by the Communist Revolution of 1949, and then once again by the Cultural Revolution in the 60s. So it's not that recent a thing where this is happening. Well, stay tuned here on Beyond the Headlines. We've got Net Check coming up next.